The sun had already slipped behind the western hills, leaving the desert soaked in copper light as the old rancher rode back toward his lonely cabin. For years, the wind had been his only companion, whispering through the dry mesquite trees and rattling against the boards of his barn. His ranch stood miles away from the nearest town, a silent kingdom of dust, silence, and buried memories. Once, he had fought wars for men who'd forgotten his name. Once, he had loved and lost. Now he only raised his cattle, mended his fences, and waited for the quiet nights to end. But fate had a strange way of finding those who wanted nothing from the world. That evening, as his horse slowed by the old trail near the canyon, he heard something that froze his heart, a scream, thin and desperate, echoing between the stones. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the sand, and followed the sound to where the dying light flickered between the sagebrush. There, in a clearing, he saw 3 men, drunk, laughing, and cruel. They were beating an Apache woman, her face hidden beneath tangled hair, her body shielding 2 small girls who clung to her skirt in terror. The sight burned through the rancher's soul like fire through dry wood. For years, he had told himself he was done fighting. But the West never lets a man stay peaceful for long. Without a word, he drew his rifle. The crack of the shot shattered the silence, one of the men dropping instantly. The others turned, their laughter dying as the old rancher stepped forward, his eyes cold as the iron barrel pointed at their chests. "Leave her," he said, his voice low and steady. The men hesitated, but the rancher's stance told them he wasn't bluffing. They spat, cursed, then ran into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the wild wind. He lowered his weapon, his hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of old memories. The woman lay still, her breath ragged, blood tracing lines down her cheek. The 2 girls looked up at him, eyes wide with fear and hope tangled together. He knelt, offering water from his canteen, whispering soft words that even he didn't know he remembered how to say. The night grew colder, stars spilling across the sky like shards of broken glass. He made a fire beside them, tending their wounds as coyotes howled far away. Something inside him stirred, a feeling buried under years of solitude and sorrow. The woman did not speak, only watched him with wary eyes, as if she couldn't decide whether he was savior or threat. But when he wrapped a blanket around her daughters, she bowed her head, and in that small gesture, the rancher felt something shift in his chest. Dawn broke slow and red across the desert. He helped them onto his horse, leading them back to his ranch. The journey was silent but heavy with unspoken things, the pain of survival, the fear of trust, and the strange, fragile thread that had tied their fates together. When they reached his cabin, he offered them food and warmth, his mind restless with questions he couldn't ask. Why had those men attacked her? Why were the girls being punished for their birth? In the dim light of the cabin, the truth began to form, a cruel story of hatred and betrayal that stretched across the lands of the West, where survival itself was a sin for some. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but as he watched the 3 of them sleep by the dying fire, he knew one thing: he would not let harm touch them again. The West had taken too much from too many. This time, he would fight back. And if you, listener, believe that courage and mercy still matter in a world gone wild, then stay with this story, and don't forget to morning came slow over the plains, the golden light spilling across the ranch like a silent promise of new beginnings. The old rancher stood outside his cabin, watching the horizon as the wind carried the smell of dust and sage. Behind him, the woman and her 2 daughters were awake, sitting quietly near the small fire he had made. The girls were playing with a wooden horse he had carved years ago for no one in particular, perhaps waiting for a reason to care again. Now, he found that reason in their laughter, faint but real. The woman, bruised and still weak, kept her eyes low, as if unsure whether kindness could truly exist in a world that had given her nothing but pain. He poured coffee into a tin cup, handed it to her, and for the first time, she spoke, not in words he understood, but with a tone that carried gratitude and fear together. She pointed toward the horizon, to the direction from where he had found her, her face tightening as she whispered something about men who would return. The rancher understood. Trouble was coming. He looked at the girls, at their small, fragile hands clutching each other, and something inside him hardened. He had lived too long with ghosts, too long believing that his war was over. Now he knew the fight had found him again. That afternoon, he rode out to the ridge above his ranch, scanning the canyon with his old spyglass. Dust trails rose in the distance, 3 riders, maybe 4, moving slow but certain. He returned to the cabin, loaded his rifle, and checked the revolver strapped to his hip. The woman watched him, her eyes filled with silent worry. He nodded to her, not as a man giving orders but as someone making a promise. "No one touches them," he murmured. The hours dragged by like years until the riders finally appeared at the edge of his land. They were the same kind of men he had seen before, mean eyes, rough laughter, and the smell of whiskey and arrogance. Their leader called out, saying they had come for the woman, claiming she had stolen something that wasn't hers. The rancher didn't answer. He just stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, the sun glinting off the metal like a warning. "You're trespassing," he said. The men laughed, spitting into the dirt. "Old man, you don't want to die for an Apache." The rancher's silence was their only answer. The first man reached for his gun, but the old soldier's reflexes hadn't died with his youth. The shotgun roared, echoing through the valley, scattering birds from the trees. Chaos broke loose, gunfire cracked, dust rose, and the screams of horses filled the air. When the echo finally died, only the rancher stood upright, breathing heavy, smoke curling from his weapon. 2 of the men lay dead, the others fled into the wilderness, leaving their wounded behind. The woman stepped out of the cabin, her hand shaking as she looked at the bodies. She said nothing, but in her eyes was a storm of pain, sorrow, and something else, respect. The girls ran to the rancher, holding onto his leg, their tears soaking into the dust. He placed a rough hand on their heads, unsure what comfort even meant anymore. That night, the wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood. The rancher sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He knew this wasn't over. Men like those didn't forgive or forget, they gathered more and came back with vengeance. Yet, as he looked at the small family sleeping safely inside, he felt no fear, only purpose. The West was cruel, but even cruelty bowed before a heart that refused to break. Somewhere deep inside, the men who had given up on life began to live again. He found himself mending fences not just of wood but of fate, building walls not to keep the world out but to protect what little innocence was left in it. Tomorrow would bring new danger, but tonight, beneath the endless sky, the lone rancher made a vow, to guard them with every last breath, no matter the cost. And if you, rider of the wild winds, believe that courage still rides under the dying sun, then stay tuned to this tale, and don't forget the next morning came heavy with silence, a silence that felt like the calm before a storm. The rancher could sense it, the uneasy stillness in the air, the restless cry of crows circling above the canyon. He stepped outside, his rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon that seemed too quiet to trust. Inside the cabin, the woman tended to her daughters, their small voices whispering softly as if afraid the wind might carry their sound to the wrong ears. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he loaded his last few bullets, he knew the fight was far from over. Just before noon, a distant echo reached the ranch, a single shot, then another. Dust rose in the distance like ghosts returning. The same men were back, and this time they weren't alone. He moved quickly, leading the woman and her girls into the cellar he dug long ago for storms that never came. "Stay there," he said, his voice low but steady. She looked at him, fear shining in her eyes, then nodded once. He closed the wooden hatch and turned toward the open land, the heat shimmering like fire over the sand. The riders came fast, guns drawn, shouting curses that mixed with the cries of their horses. The rancher took his stand behind the corral fence, his breath deep and calm. The first bullet grazed his hat, the second hit the post near his shoulder. He fired back, once, twice, each shot precise, deliberate. 2 men fell, their bodies rolling in the dust. But there were more coming, too many. The old rancher moved toward the barn, reloading, heart pounding with the rhythm of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to protect. Then, just as the last rider charged, a sharp sound cut through the air, a rifle shot from the hill. The woman had climbed out of the cellar, her aim steady, her fear gone. Together they fought until the dust settled and silence returned once more. The land was littered with the fallen, but the ranch stood. He looked at her, both knowing words weren't needed. She had become part of his world now, not out of choice, but out of survival. The rancher turned toward the setting sun, whispering to himself that maybe, after all these years, he had finally found subscribe for more Wild West stories.